A desperate bid at an infamous auction sealed the fate of a young pregnant woman and a solitary farmer. Secrets, dangers, and an improbable love blossomed in the dust of the arid plains. What happened when the hammer fell would change their lives in ways no one could foresee. Prepare yourself. This story will grip you and touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. What went through a man's soul when, amidst the dust and despair, he saw not a burden but a spark of life to be saved? The auctioneer's hammer came down with the brutality of a gunshot, echoing through the dusty village square that barely deserved the name of a settlement. Suspended on the makeshift platform, a man in a faded vest announced the next lot, with an unctuous voice that the dry air couldn't mitigate. A young woman, her belly prominent under a threadbare dress, her eyes fixed on the ground as if searching for a crack to flee into. Beside her, an older couple, her parents, their faces set in a mask of shame and cruel pragmatism. The news had spread like fire in dry straw. Their daughter, promised to another who had disappeared or died before honoring the commitment, carried a bastard. For the parents, people fearful of gossip and misery, she was now a burden to be discarded as quickly and, if possible, as profitably as possible. In the small crowd of onlookers, ranchers, and vagrants, one man stood out for his silence and stillness. Tall, thin, weathered by the merciless sun of the plains, his face bore the marks of someone who had known few joys and much labor. It was John, a farmer of arid lands, whose stubbornness in wringing sustenance from the ungrateful soil was legendary and, for many, pathetic. His striking features were an almost palpable honesty, which made him an easy target for the sharper swords. A resilient stubbornness, sometimes mistaken for stupidity, and an ancient sadness lodged deep in his eyes, a remnant of a loss, his wife Mary and stillborn child. That time had not healed, but merely taught him to carry like a stone in his chest. His internal conflict was the paralyzing fear of failing again to protect those who depended on him, a guilt that gnawed at him like rust corrodes iron. He had come to the village for supplies, seeds, and perhaps a little kerosene, not for a spectacle of human degradation. But something in the young woman's posture, a besieged dignity, a spark of defiance amidst resignation, held him. The smell of cheap tobacco, sweat, and dust hung in the air, mingled with the distant aroma of gunpowder from some morning hunt. The sun beat down like an iron hammer on his worn hat. When the bidding began, low, hesitant, laden with mockery and poorly disguised lust, John felt his blood boil. They were vultures circling a wounded prey. The village, with its adobe houses and crooked fences, seemed to shrink under the weight of that casual cruelty. It was a hungry animal, devouring the hope of its inhabitants. And today, the banquet was that young woman. Each offer was a stab at her dignity, and he saw her shoulders slump a little more with each new voice. Her parents looked away, mentally counting the coins that would fall into their dirty hands. John thought of his land, of his solitude, of the silence of his empty house. He thought of the promise he had made to himself, never again to allow fragility to be crushed before his eyes if he could prevent it. That old fear, the fear of failing, fought against a new impulse, a need to intervene that was almost physical. The bids rose slowly, copper coins changing imaginary hands. A fat foreman with a lecherous smile seemed about to win. That was when John's voice, hoarse from disuse and dust, cut through the air. 50 silver coins. A shocked silence fell over the square. 50 coins was a considerable sum, more than the young woman in those circumstances would ever be worth to those men. The auctioneer, surprised, cleared his throat. 50 coins from Farmer John. Anyone give more? The young woman's eyes, Sarah, as he would later know her name, lifted from the ground for the first time and met his. There was surprise, fear, but also a question. The fat foreman grumbled, but did not raise the bid. No one else dared. 50 coins once, 50 coins twice, sold to Farmer John. The hammer fell again, sealing her fate to his. John felt a weight in his stomach. What had he done? The young woman's parents quickly approached, their eyes gleaming with greed. John paid, the silver clinking with an obscene sound in that transaction. He did not look at them. His eyes were fixed on the young woman, who now stared at him with an indecipherable mix of apprehension and perhaps, just perhaps, a shred of relief. He merely nodded at her. "Come." The journey back to his farm, Solitary Path Farm, was silent and tense. The cart creaked under the weight of the supplies and the two unexpected passengers, him and Sarah. The afternoon sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with oranges and purples that did not match the aridity of the land nor the sadness in their hearts. John offered Sarah a sip of water from his canteen, and she accepted with an almost inaudible murmur of thanks. He tried not to stare at her, but he felt the weight of her gaze, investigative, scared. He was not a man of many words, and now they seemed even scarcer. What do you say to a woman you just bought as if she were an animal? Guilt and uncertainty consumed him. They arrived at John's small adobe house at dusk. It was simple, almost bare, but clean. There was only one room and a kitchen. The reality of the situation hit him hard. He indicated a cot in a corner of the main room. "You can stay there. It's the best I have." She merely nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings with an exhausted expression. He prepared a frugal meal, cooked beans with a piece of jerky and flour. They ate in silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the small fireplace and the wind whistling outside, a constant lament on those plains. After eating, Sarah huddled on the cot, turning her face to the wall. John sat by the door, looking out at the darkness, his heart heavy. He had saved her from the auction, but from what else? And at what cost to both of them? The first night was a torment of thoughts for John. Her presence in the house was a constant reminder of his impulsiveness, but also of the fragility of the life he now, in some way, had become responsible for. He remembered his late wife, Mary, the joy that preceded the tragedy. The fear of reliving that pain was a constant shadow. Sarah, in turn, barely slept. Every creak of the house, every sound of the night startled her. Who was this man? What would he want from her? Despite his initial kindness, fear was still her closest companion. The next morning brought an awkward routine. John left early to tend to his small corn and bean patch, stubbornly trying to wring life from that stony soil. Sarah remained in the house, hesitant. When he returned for lunch, he found the dishes washed and a shy arrangement of wildflowers in a cracked glass on the rough table. It was the first sign, the first tiny bridge over the abyss of distrust that separated them. He didn't comment, just thanked her with a nod, but something in that simple gesture struck a chord in his hardened chest. Days turned into weeks. Communication between them was minimal, made up of gestures and monosyllables. John worked from dawn till dusk, and Sarah took care of the house, cooked and mended his few clothes. Her belly grew, slowing her movements, but she didn't complain. He watched her from afar, noticing the sadness in her eyes, but also a quiet strength that he had come to admire. He began to leave small portions of dried fruit or a piece of cheese he managed to get in rare trades in the nearest village, without saying anything, just for her to find. They were crumbs of care, cast with the caution of someone who fears being misunderstood. Sarah's past was a shadow that lengthened with the afternoon sun, threatening to cover the small sprout of trust that was growing between them, and John felt this shadow looming. Even without knowing its details, he knew the village wouldn't forget, and he knew their tranquility was fragile as glass. One afternoon, while mending one of John's work shirts, already worn thin by constant use in the merciless sun, Sarah found a larger tear near the shoulder. She spent hours fixing it with needle and thread, using a piece of fabric from one of her own old dresses, of a similar color. When John returned, tired and covered in dust, he found the shirt folded on his cot, the almost invisible patch, a work of patience and care. He picked up the shirt, feeling the softness of the patch under his calloused fingers. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. That night, for the first time, he made conversation beyond what was necessary. He asked about the place she came from, a simple question, but one that opened a small crack in her wall of silence. She spoke little, in a low voice, about greener fields and a river she hadn't seen in a long time. He listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of longing in her words. That was the second moment, a thread of understanding woven into the rough tapestry of their lives. Tension began to settle not only within the small house but around it. Once, upon returning from his furthest field, John found strange footprints near the small creek that supplied the farm. They weren't from known wild animals, nor his own. They were from boots, heavy boots, from someone observing. He didn't say anything to Sarah not to worry her, but his senses became sharper, the old shotgun always within reach. The fear that Sarah's past, or the cruelty of the world he had tried to leave behind, would come knocking at his door, became a constant presence. He began patrolling the property at dusk, his eyes sweeping the darkness, his heart tight. One night, sitting outside, watching the stars that seemed incredibly close in the clear sky of the arid plains, the silence was broken by Sarah. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice little more than a whisper. "Why did you buy me?" John took a long time to answer, choosing his words carefully. I saw something in you. No one deserves to be treated that way." He hesitated, then continued, his voice choked with memory. I lost my family a long time ago. My wife, Mary, and our child, who never breathed. I couldn't protect them. Maybe I just didn't want to see another life crushed." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Sarah turned to him, her eyes wet in the moonlight. "I'm sorry," she said, and the sincerity in her voice was palpable. She then told him a little of her own story, of the young man she had been promised to, a boy named Thomas, who had left in search of fortune and never sent word again. She spoke of her parents' shame, the fear of the future, the loneliness. That night, under the starry sky, they shared their pains, and the thread between them strengthened, becoming a rope. It was the third crucial moment, an exchange of confidences that brought them closer in a way neither of them expected. He saw the strength behind her apparent fragility, and she saw the kindness behind the rough facade of that solitary man. Life on Solitary Path Farm continued, but something had changed. There was less awkward silence and more hesitant conversations. There were small smiles exchanged, a tacit understanding that grew each day. John began to talk about his dreams for the land, about the olive trees he wanted to plant, about the hope of one day seeing the creek run stronger. Sarah listened and sometimes offered a suggestion, an idea. She began to tend the small herb garden he barely touched, and soon the aroma of basil and rosemary mingled with the smell of earth and wood smoke. But the shadow of danger had not dissipated. One day, a distant neighbor, an old man named Samuel, who rarely ventured to John's farm, showed up with worrying news. "I heard tell in the village," he began, his voice low and cautious, "that a man is asking around for a pregnant woman. A tall man with a scar on his face. They say he's Thomas's brother, the disappeared fiancé of the girl you took in." John's blood ran cold. David, Thomas's brother, was known for his cruelty and violent temper. If he was looking for Sarah, it wouldn't be for good reasons. The news fell like a stone in the small world they were building. Fear returned with full force, but now it was different. It wasn't just John's fear for Sarah, or Sarah's fear of the unknown. It was the fear of losing what, almost without realizing it, they had begun to build together. John thanked Samuel, his face a mask of worry. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of the man with the scar haunted his thoughts. He needed to protect Sarah and the child she carried. The child who, somehow, had already become part of his worries and hopes. The tension was palpable, a stretched thread about to break. The approach of danger hung over Solitary Path Farm like a storm cloud. John reinforced the locks on the door and window and kept the shotgun always loaded and nearby. He instructed Sarah to hide in the small root cellar if she heard anything strange and he wasn't around. Her eyes, once merely sad, now carried a new layer of anxiety, but also a determination that mirrored his. Work on the farm continued, but it was done with an ear attentive to any unusual sound, any sign of approach. The wind, once a constant companion, now seemed to whisper warnings. One morning, while John was checking the small animal traps he had set on the property line, he found a clear sign, a snare of his own making, disarmed and tossed aside with contempt, and beside it, a single black feather, like a sinister calling card. There was no doubt. Someone had been there. Very close. He returned home with his heart pounding, the urgency etched in every line of his face. That day, Sarah's pregnancy seemed to weigh more heavily on her. She moved with difficulty, and a worrying paleness took over her face. John, despite the external threat, felt a different kind of panic. What if something happened to her, to the baby, before David even found them? He helped her sit down, offered her fresh water, and tried to hide his own apprehension. "You need to rest," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She held his hand for an instant, a fragile touch, but loaded with a trust that moved him deeply. "I'm fine, John. Just a little tired," but her eyes said otherwise. That afternoon, as a fine rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud and bringing a damp, earthy smell that would normally be welcome, Sarah began to feel stronger pains. They weren't labor pains, it was still too early, but something wasn't right. She became feverish, her lips dry, and John felt despair take over him. There was no doctor nearby. The nearest village was half a day's journey away, and with David's threat, leaving was an immense risk. He cared for her as best he could, applying cold compresses, offering herbal teas he remembered his grandmother using. Seeing her so vulnerable, so dependent on him, broke the last barriers of his emotional reserve. He held her hand, murmuring words of comfort he barely knew where they came from. She, amidst the fever and pain, clung to him like a lifeline. In that moment of shared fragility, where the fear of illness mingled with the fear of the enemy outside, they connected on an even deeper level. He was her protector, she was his responsibility, but also something more, something he didn't yet dare to name. It was the fourth moment, mutual vulnerability forging a bond of steel. The fever slowly subsided at dawn, leaving Sarah exhausted but lucid. The rain had stopped, and a heavy silence hung over the farm. A silence that seemed like the prelude to something terrible. John, exhausted from the night vigil, felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked through the crack in the window and saw 3 figures on horseback emerged from the morning mist, moving slowly towards the house. One of them, tall and mounted on a black horse, had a visible scar cutting across his left eyebrow. David. The moment he had feared had arrived. The violence exploded like a summer storm, sudden and devastating, sweeping away the fragile peace they had built. "They're here," John said, his voice low and grim. He helped Sarah to stand, her face pale, but her eyes steady. "Go to the root cellar. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." She hesitated, looking at him with an anguish that mirrored his own. "John, go," he ordered, more sharply than he intended, fear making his voice harsh. She nodded and with difficulty moved towards the trapdoor hidden under a straw mat. John grabbed the shotgun, checked the load. His heart beat like a war drum. He wasn't a fighter, he was a farmer. But that land, that house, that woman, and the life she carried, they were his to protect. He stepped out onto the porch, shotgun in hand, his face a mask of grim determination. The 3 riders stopped at a respectful but threatening distance. David dismounted, a cruel smile on his lips. "Farmer," he said, his drawn-out voice full of contempt, "I've come for what's mine, my brother's woman and his bastard." "She's not yours," John replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "She doesn't belong to anyone. And this is my property, I suggest you leave." David laughed, an ugly sound that cut the morning air. "You're brave or very stupid. Thomas may have disappeared, but my family's honor hasn't. She carries his child. That belongs to us." The other 2 men, thugs with brutish faces, dismounted too, drawing long, rusty machetes. The smell of danger was acrid in the air, mixed with that of wet earth. "She stays," John said, cocking the shotgun. "If you want to try and take her, you'll have to go through me." The challenge was made. David signaled and the 2 thugs advanced. John knew he had only 1 bullet in the shotgun before needing to reload, a slow process. He aimed at the nearest one, the one coming from the right, and fired. The man screamed and fell, clutching his wounded leg. The other hesitated for an instant, long enough for John to drop the empty shotgun and draw the old bush machete he always carried at his waist. David remained where he was, watching with sadistic interest. The second thug attacked with fury, his machete whistling through the air. John, though not a trained warrior, knew the weight and balance of his tool. He parried the first blow, metal clashing with a sharp clang. The fight was desperate. John fought with the strength of someone defending not just his own life, but everything dear to him. He felt a sharp pain in his arm when the thug's blade grazed him, but the adrenaline prevented him from feeling the extent of the wound. He stumbled back, tripping, and the thug advanced for the final blow. It was then that the root cellar door burst open. Sarah emerged, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. In her hands she held a heavy iron pot. With a cry that mixed fear and fury, she ran towards the thug, threatening John, and struck him with all her might on the back of the head. The man collapsed like a sack of stones, unconscious. John looked at Sarah, stunned and filled with an overwhelming admiration. She trembled, the pot still raised, but she did not back down. David, who had watched everything with a surprise that quickly turned to rage, drew a pistol from his belt. "You daring bitch," he growled, pointing the weapon at Sarah. John acted purely on instinct. Ignoring the pain in his arm, he lunged at David, tackling him to the muddy ground. The pistol fired, the shot narrowly missing John's head and disappearing into the vastness of the sky. The two rolled in the mud, exchanging punches. David was stronger, more experienced in brutality, but John fought with the fury of a cornered animal protecting its young. He felt David's knuckles on his face, the taste of blood in his mouth. The sight of Sarah, pale and scared, but still standing, gave him renewed strength. He managed to pin David's arm holding the pistol, twisting it until he heard a snap and a cry of pain from the thug. The gun fell into the mud. John landed a punch on David's face, then another. When David seemed stunned, John grabbed him by the collar and dragged him, panting, away from the house. The thug, wounded in the leg, tried to get up, but the pain was too much. The other remained unconscious. John tied David with a rope he used to secure loads on the cart, then did the same with the wounded thug, using leather strips. The immediate danger had passed, but the air was still heavy with the tension of battle. John leaned against the house wall, exhausted, his arm bleeding, his body aching. Sarah ran to him, her eyes full of tears and relief. "John, you're hurt!" She tore a piece of her dress and began to clean the wound on his arm, her hands trembling, but steady. Her touch was gentle, and he felt a wave of warmth spread through his body, despite the pain. He had protected her, and she, in her own way, had also protected him. In that moment, with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and wet earth around them, the bond between them became unbreakable. It was the fifth moment, mutual sacrifice and courage sealing a silent pact, stronger than any word or promise. He looked at her, at the unexpected strength she had shown, at the genuine concern in her eyes. "We made it, Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse. "We made it." The dust of battle, or rather the mud, began to settle. John, with Sarah's hesitant help, managed to get the two conscious thugs, though one wounded, onto their horses. David, tied and furious, was hoisted onto his own animal. John pointed the reloaded shotgun in the direction of the village. "Get out," he ordered, his voice flat. "And if you come back, or if I hear you cause trouble for anyone because of me, I'll hunt you down one by one. Understand?" David spat on the ground, but the fear in his eyes was visible. He said nothing. The thugs just nodded, eager to leave. John watched them ride away, figures growing smaller in the vastness of the plains, until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he allow exhaustion to fully hit him. He went back inside, where Sarah had already heated water and prepared clean cloths. She tended his wounds with a gentleness that surprised him. The cut on his arm was ugly, but didn't seem to have hit any important bones. As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, her fingers brushed his skin, and a different kind of warmth, a warmth that didn't come from fever or fighting, began to spread through him. "You were brave," he said, breaking the silence. "Braver than I ever imagined." Sarah raised her eyes, a slight blush coloring her pale cheeks. I couldn't let him hurt you anymore." The words were simple, but carried a deep meaning. The "we" he had said before echoed now in her gesture, in her concern. The house, once a fragile refuge, now seemed like a fortress, defended by two souls who had found strength in each other. In the days that followed, A new normalcy settled in. David's threat had been repelled, but the memory of the violence lingered, reminding them of the fragility of peace. John slowly recovered from the arm wound, and Sarah, despite the scare, seemed more serene. The traumatic experience, instead of driving them apart, had solidified their mutual trust. They talked more, shared small tasks, and the silence between them was no longer awkward, but one of quiet comfort. A few weeks later, on a night when the full moon bathed Solitary Path Farm with a silver light, Sarah woke John with a low moan. The pains had begun. This time, they were labor pains. The initial panic John felt was quickly replaced by a determined calm. He remembered Mary's death, the feeling of helplessness. This time, it wouldn't be like that. He wasn't alone, and neither was Sarah. He helped her, following the hesitant instructions she gave between contractions, remembering things he had heard from older women in his childhood. The night was long and hard. John held Sarah's hand, wiped the sweat from her brow, whispered words of encouragement. He saw her strength, the resilience of life fighting to enter the world. And then, just before dawn, as the first rays of sun painted the sky pink and gold, a strong, healthy cry echoed through the small house. A boy. John cut the umbilical cord with trembling hands, the machete sterilized in the fire. He cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft cloth, handing him to Sarah. Her eyes, exhausted but bright with happiness, met his. In that moment, seeing Sarah holding the child in her arms, a child he had helped bring into the world, a child he had defended with his own life, John felt the old sadness in his chest finally begin to yield. It wasn't forgetting, but an acceptance, a new layer of meaning over the old pain. "He's beautiful, Sarah," John said, his voice choked. "What will his name be?" Sarah looked at the baby, then at John, a tender smile on her lips. I thought of Daniel. It means God is my judge, but also, I thought maybe you'd want to choose a middle name." John was surprised. He looked at the small being in her arms, at the trust in Sarah's eyes. How about Daniel John?" he suggested, almost in a whisper. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Daniel John, it's perfect." Life on Solitary Path Farm changed radically with the arrival of Daniel John. The small house, once silent, was now filled with the sounds of a baby. John discovered a new facet of himself, that of a father. He learned to change improvised diapers, to soothe the baby when he cried, to watch with fascination the tiny fingers gripping his own. Sarah blossomed in motherhood. The sadness in her eyes was replaced by a sparkle of love and contentment. She and John worked together, caring for the baby, the house, the land. Their partnership deepened, transforming into a quiet, resilient love, forged in adversity and nourished by mutual respect. Their love, born in misfortune and fear, was like a tree of the arid plains with deep roots planted in the arid soil of trial, but with branches that extended to the sky, displaying resistant and colorful flowers, promising shade and fruit even under life's most merciless sun. They didn't need grand words to define what they felt. It was in the glances exchanged over the makeshift crib, in the gestures of care, in the way they shared bread and worries. News of the confrontation with David and the baby's birth eventually reached the village, brought by hunters or travelers. Some still looked with suspicion, but others, like old Samuel, viewed the family John and Sarah had formed with admiration. Their story became a kind of local legend, a testament to the courage and the human spirit's capacity to find happiness even in the most unlikely places. One afternoon, months later, John sat on the porch, watching Sarah rock Daniel John while humming a soft lullaby. The sun was setting, painting the sky with the same vibrant colors he had seen the day he brought her home. But now they no longer seemed out of place. They reflected the beauty and hope they had found together. Sarah looked at him and smiled, a genuine smile full of love. John smiled back. The old sadness in his eyes hadn't completely disappeared. It was part of who he was, of the scars life had left him. But now it was accompanied by a new light, a light of peace and contentment. He no longer feared failing to protect those he loved, for he had discovered that true protection came from union, shared courage, the love that faced storms head-on. Solitary Path Farm was no longer so solitary. It was a home. And there, in that small adobe house under the vast sky of the arid plains, an unlikely family had found its unlikely happy ending, an ending that was, in fact, a new beginning, full of silent promises and the certainty that, together, they could face anything the future held. The land, once merely arid, now seemed fertile, ready to receive the seeds not just of corn and beans, but of dreams and a future built by 4 hands, or rather, by 6. The cry of Daniel John was the sweetest song those walls had ever heard.